Cal and just go with the one person?
Totally agree.
But, you know, it is California.
Yeah, totally.
Thanks, Alex. A water shortage in Iran sparking protests in the streets as temperatures hit 120 degrees. At least 8 people were killed by local law enforcement after firing on protesters to stop the demonstrations. Now, there is a call from the mainstream media to speak up on this issue. Joining us now to discuss is Executive Director of the Iranian Americans for Liberty, Brian Lieb. Good morning, Brian.
Hi, Mercedes. Good morning. How are you?
Wonderful. I got to read your article, your most recent article on newsmax.com. And you say silence from mainstream media on recent protests in Iran is unacceptable. Why has the mainstream media ignored this story? In the article, you talk about that during the Obama years, it became, an unspoken policy that the U.S. government will restrict itself to moot criticisms and vague references to human rights abuses in official statements and would never say or do anything publicly to criticize the regime. What changed under President Trump, and is the Biden administration just going to ignore this issue?
Yeah, sadly, so far they are ignoring the issue, whether it's President Biden himself or the administration and senior leadership throughout the administration. They're turning the other cheek when it comes to the protests that are happening inside of Iran right now. Obviously, President Trump took a much different stance, a much different approach. And he was active on social media. He was active with the media. And when he talked about Iran, the media would pay attention. Unfortunately, President Biden has not said a single word about the protests that are happening right now inside of Iran, so the media is not going to cover it. And it's worth noting, Mercedes, that the protests that are happening right now, while they started in very small provinces throughout Iran with regards to water shortages and with regards to electricity outages, have grown now to the streets of Tehran, where they're chanting for death to the dictator and to stop spending money in Lebanon and in Gaza. The people of Iran want freedom, they want liberty, and they want their government to start taking care of them instead of funding proxies, terrorist proxies all throughout the world.
So we know with the Biden administration, they've talked about moving back towards JCPOA and really engagement with the Iranian regime. What is it with these Democrats in terms of the fact that they would stand with the Iranian regime, and why have they chosen not to show their support for the people of Iran?
Yeah, it's a very disturbing issue, to say the least. This past week, there were 4 or 5 members of Congress that spoke out, took to Twitter and spoke out against these protests that were happening. And unfortunately, they were all Republicans. Democrats have been largely silent on this issue, whether, again, it's the administration or it's members of the House and Senate. They've just been completely silent. And you're showing pictures on the screen right now of what's happening inside of Iran right now. How can this be ignored? How can the people of Iran taking to the streets for freedom be ignored by this administration? All signs point to, you mentioned the JCPOA, all signs point to, unfortunately, this president and his administration are doing everything that they can to get back into this deal with the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, and also the leading, the most notorious human rights abuser as well. So I've been very clear, and so have a lot of other people. We've got to take a strong stance against the Iranian regime. They are not friends of ours. They are not allies of ours. They are adversaries, and that's how we need to treat them, with strength, not with weakness.
One of the things you mentioned in your article was a lack of internet access that many of these protesters have. Obviously, the Iranian regime, they shut it down to the people of Iran. Does that contribute to the problem of the mainstream media not covering this? Now, I know Newsmax has been covering this issue. We've been talking about this issue, about the protest. But does that contribute to the fact of the silence coming from the mainstream media?
Well, of course it does. How is the mainstream media and the American people at large going to know what's happening when the regime turns off the internet? And just for contrast, I want the American people and your viewers to think for a second. When the BLM riots were happening, What would have happened if the U.S. government turned off the internet so those riots could not be documented and shared and spread all throughout social media? No one would have known about them. And unfortunately, that's the situation right now where the regime, and this is a common practice that they've been using for years now, when their people take to the streets, they turn off the internet. They silence their voices. Twitter is not allowed unless you're the Ayatollahs in Iran. So it's a big double standard, unfortunately, that's coming out of that country. And we as Americans have to do everything that we can to raise our voices in support of the freedom-loving people of Iran. These people, there needs to be a difference between the regime and the people. The people want freedom. The regime want terrorism. So it's pretty clear.
Yeah, there's no question that there is this desire for freedom across the globe. It's not just an American phenomenon, but it's a global movement. And sadly, these authoritarian regimes keep shutting down these freedom-loving people who are trying to save their countries. But thank you, Brian Lieb. I appreciate your commentary as well as that article on Newsmax.com. So coming up on